the theory says that something that's happened before in a self-organizing system is more likely to happen again. So if you make a new chemical for the first time and crystallize it, the crystals won't have formed before, and you may have to wait a long time. Often you have to wait years for the first crystals to form. But once they've formed, there's now a pattern in nature for this. And if you try crystallizing the same thing again, it should get easier. And the more you do it, the easier it should get. And this is actually what chemists find. But they don't they just take it for granted that it's them getting better at doing it, or bits of previous crystals get wafted around the world as dust in the atmosphere. So this is a well-known phenomenon. Also, it predicts that if rats learn a new trick in London, then rats in New York and Sydney, Australia, and Cape Town, South Africa, should all be able to learn the same trick quicker, just because the rats have learned it here. It's a kind of collective memory.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we're going to be getting up to date on Rupert Sheldrake's extraordinary theory of morphic resonance. So the interaction of morphic fields, the unfolding of what Rupert calls nature's habits, and the memory of nature. We'll be examining the possibility of levels of consciousness larger than our own brains, scaling up in a hierarchy from very small cellular consciousness right up to potentially planetary or even stellar consciousness. We're also going to be getting into examples of consciousness beyond the brain, like end-of-life experiences that Rupert studied, and potentially non-local explanations for the phenomena that Rupert's reported in those experiments. Rupert Sheldrake is a Cambridge PhD developmental biologist who's published over 100 scientific papers on topics as wide as panpsychism, telepathy, pets who know when their owners are coming home, and after-death communications. He is also the author of many books like A New Science of Life, Science Set Free, and Ways of Going Beyond, among many others. Now, I have wanted to speak to Rupert since long before the podcast kicked off, so I really can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Rupert Sheldrake, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
Good to be with you, Freddie.
Well, I love to get started, Rupert, by asking my guests about the first big philosophical questions which they pondered on shortly after they sort of noticed their own thoughts, usually sometime sort of 8 onwards. Which of those pressing questions stick out when you look back?
Gosh, I haven't thought about this, Freddie, so I don't have an instant answer.
Feel free to pull it out of the bag, just whatever comes up, because that's kind of what we like about this. It's about remembering that scientists were innocent and just raw in the face of the great mystery, even when they were younger, just like us.
Well, I think when I was about 5 or 6, I was lying in my bed at home, which was in Neo-platonism in Nottinghamshire, and the sunlight was streaming in through the bedroom window, and there were dust particles in the sun, and I could see these dust particles moving around in the sunlight. And I suppose it was the first really big thought I had, because it struck me at the time, that what if each dust particle was itself a world or a universe, and there were worlds, countless worlds or universes, each particle was a different world. And so this idea that there could be all sorts of other worlds and was a really big idea for me. I mean, I don't know where it came from, but I remember being staggered by the possibility of thinking something like that. So that was perhaps a kind of key moment for me. And since we're on the subject, when I was about 5, I was at the family farm, which is in a village called Farndon near Newark. And I had an uncle, and I was walking through the farmyard, and I saw a row of willow trees with barbed wire, rusty barbed wire hanging between them. So I said to him, why is that barbed wire between the willow trees? He said, because we made a fence out of willow stakes, and the stakes came to life and turned into trees. That had a huge effect on me, the idea that something that was seemingly dead could uh, regenerate and turn into a tree. And when I did my PhD at Cambridge in plant development, without being aware of this, I didn't remember this till later. I was actually doing experiments with bits of stem and the regeneration of stem, and including willow stems. So these impressions in childhood can have a very strong effect. And actually, a lot of my work since then has really been about how dead mechanical nature is coming back to life. So that was again a very important, but it started from some, the actual visual impression of something. It was stimulated by what was actually happening.
Well, it's interesting how often these strong childhood impressions sort of leave a mark and they motivate us later on. Now, Rupert, getting straight into our first main topic for today, your theory of morphic resonance, that in developmental biology, memory is inherent in nature, not necessarily as laws of nature, but as dynamically evolving habits, as you call them, discussed most prominently in your now classic book, A New Science of Life. Can you tell us this story of how, during your 15 years as a researcher of developmental biology at Cambridge, you slowly came to the conclusion that genetics wasn't enough, and how you agreed with the host of scientists that since the 1920s have been arguing that biological development follows biological fields, not just genetics? And maybe just give us a few examples of morphic resonance so we can visualize it.
When I was doing research at Cambridge, I was working on the plant hormone Auxin, which is chemically indole acetic acid. It's related to tryptophan and to tryptamine, and indeed 5-hydroxytryptamine, and that family of compounds. And what I discovered when I was doing my PhD is that this hormone is released by dying cells. It's a breakdown product of cell death. Dying plant cells release it, dying yeast cells release it, dying animal cells release it. It's a non-specific product of cell death that had become a plant hormone and is mainly produced inside plants when the wood cells form, because they form little tubes and then they commit suicide and dissolve themselves. So death was in the midst of life. That was and then I discovered how this plant hormone is transported in a polar direction from the shoots towards the roots, the polar auxin transport system. I worked out how it works. I mean, these were major advances in plant science. But having made these major advances, which took plant sciences at the time beyond anything anyone had achieved in animal development, because we knew the compound, we knew how it was made, we knew how it was transported, I then realized it didn't really explain very much, because the same auxin, the same transport system, is in all plants, ferns, palm trees, grass, sunflowers, cabbages, roses. And it's in all parts of the same plant, in the petals and the sepals of a rose, and the leaves, the stems, and the roots. So, although these hormones were considered to be primary determinants of form, they just explained too much. It was like they didn't really explain the form itself. It's rather like saying you discover that if you're analyzing lots of buildings, that they're permeated by electric cables, and the cables go to all the rooms and so on. But it's not the cables shaping the rooms, it's the rooms shaping the cables. And the building depends on the architect's plan. And so the auxin didn't explain the form. So then I thought, well, how can we explain it? And I looked at this tradition in biology since the 1920s of morphogenetic fields, of form-shaping fields, so that a leaf would be shaped by a leaf field, which would be like a kind of blueprint for a leaf, and a sepal by a sepal field. And the shape determined by these fields was not really determined by the chemicals within it. I mean, our arms and our legs, for example, have different shapes, but they have the same DNA, the same muscle proteins, the same bone chemicals, the same nerve cells, etc. Yet they have different shapes. So there's something over and above genes which is shaping form. The genes just enable us to make the right proteins or switch on and off protein synthesis. So I came to this realization around, well, I was doing this around 1970, 71. And so I got very interested in these fields, which were very out of fashion at the time because everyone thought genes would explain everything. And so I came to the conclusion genes are grossly overrated and that something else is determining form, these fields. So then the question came, how are these fields inherited? Because clearly a rose inherits rose fields and a cabbage inherits cabbage fields and a giraffe inherits giraffe fields. But if they're not in the genes, then how are they inherited? And some people who were interested in these fields thought that they were just mathematical formulae that somehow timeless. But that didn't work because biology is radically historical and evolutionary. So what happens in the past must affect what happens now. And at that stage, I read a book by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, Matter and Memory, first published in English in 1911. And Bergson argued there's a kind of causation where memory can leap straight across time. It doesn't have to be stored in between in material structures. This, for me, was a hugely liberating thought. And I realized that if the past could influence the present directly based on similarity, of vibrational activity, then there could be a memory inherent in all life and indeed in all nature. So that was really the idea of morphic resonance. And in fact, that came to me in 1973 when I was a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, and research fellow of the Royal Society doing research in Cambridge. And when I thought of this, I had several days of kind of hyperactive mental activity as I realized how many things this could apply to and how much this theory could explain. But I realized I couldn't publish it because I hadn't thought it through. I knew it would be controversial. So I resigned my fellowship at Clare. I took a job in India in an agricultural research institute, wanting to step back and think about this for some time, which I did. I loved working in agriculture in India. I was doing practical experiments in real fields. And then I got to the point where I thought I could write it up and put it forward in a serious scientific way, which is when I then wrote my book, A New Science of Life, which I wrote in South India, living in the ashram of Father Bede Griffiths, a Benedictine monk who lived in a Christian ashram in Tamil Nadu on the bank of a sacred river, the
And
Corver.
Rupert, and Rupert, would you mind just giving us maybe one or potentially two different examples, just so we can really visualize exactly the explanation that you're describing and proposing?
The theory says that something that's happened before in a self-organizing system is more likely to happen again. So if you make a new chemical for the first time and crystallize it, the crystals won't have formed before, and you may have to wait a long time. Often you have to wait years for the first crystals to form. But once they've formed, there's now a pattern in nature for this. And if you try crystallizing the same thing again, it should get easier. And the more you do it, the easier it should get. And this is actually what chemists find. But they don't they just take it for granted that it's them getting better at doing it, or bits of previous crystals get wafted around the world as dust in the atmosphere. So this is a well-known phenomenon. Also, it predicts that if rats learn a new trick in London, then rats in New York and Sydney, Australia, and Cape Town, South Africa, should all be able to learn the same trick quicker, just because the rats have learned it here. It's a kind of collective memory. So it's like Jung's collective unconscious. And one experiment that's going on right now to test it is with the five-letter word puzzle Wordle, which maybe you've come across. It's a New York Times thing. It's issued every day, and it's five blanks. You have to fill in the blanks to make a five-letter word, and there are no clues. So you have to guess, and people have different strategies. And millions of people do it every day. So according to morphic resonance, should be getting easier as the day goes on. because so many millions of people have solved it, it should get easier for others to solve. And there's a student project going on right now here in Britain where the student is looking at whether Wordle does actually get easier to solve during the day. And indeed it does. And she's done it over a whole range of days so far. And on every single occasion, every single day, the same pattern. The beauty of the Wordle thing is that there's millions of people doing it anyway. They have a Wordle bot where you can deduce what's going on as the day proceeds. And there's a fresh replication of the experiment every morning with a new Wordle puzzle. So anyway, these are examples. Morphic resonance is really about memory in nature, collective memory in each species. Every individual draws upon the collective memory and contributes to it, a bit like Jung's collective unconscious. And in its most general sense, it says the so-called laws of nature are more like habits, not fixed laws that were all there at the moment of the Big Bang, but habits that have evolved along with nature, subject to natural selection.
Well, it sounds so logical. And yeah, we're big fans of Jung on this show. So there may be a question that relates to that later when we might think about where this information is encoded. Now, I'm really interested in the process of this realization. And often we talk about the experience for scientists of having these kind of aha moments. And, we could call this process when you're at Cambridge almost a gnosis in some sense. And I'm wondering if this coincided with you coming back to faith from and abandoning atheism and materialism. And also, I'm interested if during this process you anticipated that it might ostracize you from the science institution that you'd worked so hard to get work in.
Well, I was an atheist since from the age of about 14 or 15. It was just built into the way I was educated in science. It was taken for granted that atheism, materialism, and science were a package deal. And that was just, if you're a scientist, you're obviously going to be an atheist. And I took that for granted. All my science teachers took it for granted. Most scientists at Cambridge I knew took it for granted. So I was just enculturated into that way of thinking, and it made sense to me. Science was the thing of the future. I wanted to be in the vanguard of science, and so on. It's very flattering for scientists to think that they're the vanguards of human progress and left behind all the ancient superstitions and so forth. Well, I think what really began to make me question my atheist beliefs and turn me into a lapsed atheist was, first of all, traveling in India in 1968. I traveled for several months through India and Sri Lanka. I lived for a year in Malaysia, where I worked on tropical rainforest ferns in the botany department of the University of Malaya. And so this exposure to the tropics and to Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam was sort of eye-opening for me. I just didn't realize there were these much bigger worldviews than anything I'd learned about before. Then, around 1970, 71, I took LSD for the first time. And that, again, was enormously mind-opening for me. I mean, it really, literally expanded my mind. And I realized the materialist view of consciousness was very, very limited, all about just nerve impulses inside the brain, and just couldn't cope with what I was experiencing. Then I took up transcendental meditation because I wanted to explore consciousness from within. So by the time I went to India, I then got this job in India in 1974. By the time I went to India, I was really into the kind of spiritual world, but I wasn't a Christian. I was sort of more interested in Hindu philosophy, Hindu meditation and yoga, which I still am. I mean, I still meditate every day. I do yoga every day. But when I was in India, rather unexpectedly, I found myself drawn back to a Christian path, and I was confirmed in the Church of South India at the age of 34, 35 or something like that. And then I discovered Father Bede, who was the perfect bridge between the Hindu and Eastern ways of thinking and the mystical tradition in Christianity, which no one had ever told me about before. And so living in his ashram was for me both an opportunity to write my book in a very quiet place, in a palm thatched hut, in a very quiet ashram on the bank of a holy river. But also an education in the sort of depths of the Western tradition, including Neoplatonic philosophy, and which Father Bede was very well up on, and I learned a great deal about our own tradition when I was in India, perhaps paradoxically. So all of this was part of this process. But I would say that for me, challenging the dogmatism of mechanistic science actually came first, because it was through thinking about plant development and through realizing that organisms couldn't just be machines propelled by genes and proteins. I was working in the biochemistry department at Cambridge, so that's what most people assumed. And in the 1980s, it was the dawn of the Human Genome Project. The idea everything would be explained in terms of genes was overwhelmingly the popular view, and molecular biology was where the action all was and stuff. And so I didn't get a very sympathetic hearing for my ideas among my colleagues at Cambridge, because they were convinced that genes would solve everything, and all this talk of morphogenetic fields and morphic resonance was simply unnecessary. They didn't even bother trying to refute it or argue with it. They just thought it was unnecessary because they'd soon have solved all the problems of development and of consciousness in terms of molecular biology.
But did this shift inside you, were you aware at the time this is going to entail me having to step back from science with a big S? You know, did you sort of have a kind of a conscious process of realizing that this was going to break you from it in some sense?
Well, I realized it would be controversial. I studied history and philosophy of science at Harvard before I did my PhD at Cambridge. And Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, had just come out. I was at Harvard in 1963. Kuhn's book was published for the first time in 62. So in the philosophy of science department at Harvard and history and philosophy of science department, everyone was reading Kuhn. It was the exciting new thing. This was long before it had entered common currency in our culture. Of paradigm shift is now a kind of cliche, but at that stage, this was just a few people in the history and philosophy of science who were talking about this. But what Kuhn showed me was that at any given time, there's a scientific orthodoxy. Anything that doesn't fit in is marginalized, attacked, denigrated, and so on, until there's a scientific revolution when the anomalies that don't fit in to the previous model are incorporated into a bigger picture. So I was very aware of Kuhn's view, and I was very aware that what I was doing was really an attempted paradigm shift towards more holistic kind of science. So I was aware that it was going to be attacked, and it would be, people would be against it. But I also thought there were sufficient problems in biology of the insolubility of understanding regeneration and development and of consciousness, that a theory that could help deal with this could make an impact if argued in a rational scientific way with evidence and experimental tests. So my book, A New Science of Life, first published in 1981, is an attempt to expand this theory scientifically, not as a kind of lifestyle choice or vague feel-good factor or anything like that, but it was a purely scientific book written for a scientific audience with scientific references and with scientific hypotheses and scientific tests. And when the book first came out, it actually worked more or less as I'd hoped. It was debated seriously in universities. I was giving seminars to developmental biology groups. There was a serious interest in it. New Scientist did, made it a lead feature. The Guardian wrote editorials saying this is a very exciting new idea, etc., etc. So all seemed to be going very well until 3 months later, there was this famous editorial on the front page of Nature, the international journal of science, called A Book for Burning, denouncing my book and trying to excommunicate me from the scientific world. So I thought it might be possible to work within the scientific world and open up thinking about development and consciousness. But this excommunication by the editor of Nature basically declared me a heretic. I mean, he actually used that word, and made it clear that I was dangerous to know. And from then on, I couldn't get an academic job or a grant from a normal grant giving agency or lab space.
Interesting that he used a religious word there. I mean, it just shows how dogmatic he was being. He even used the word heretic.
Yes, exactly. Well, in fact, he rather ill-advisedly gave an interview to the BBC about this, in which he said, Sheldrake deserves to be condemned in the same language and for the same reason as the Pope condemned Galileo. It's heresy. So, I mean, he wasn't joking. When he was interviewed, he was really angry, and you could see he was really angry. There's a clip online of him saying this. So, but it did mean, although I always had friends in the scientific world who were and still are very friendly and helpful, it did mean it was dangerous to know, and it did mean that it was very hard to pursue this within academic institutions.
I mean, it does sound like a very hard hypothesis to test. I mean, I'm assuming the fields you're talking about aren't measurable in quite the same way that electromagnetic fields are. Give us, in your opinion, the best example of sort of, shall we say, sort of skeptic friendly, more sort of hard science evidence that you've managed to gather over the years, and whether you feel that on balance it has been proven experimentally yet.
Well, there haven't been that many tests of morphic resonance because it's very difficult for anyone in a university to do this without losing their job or being attacked or, undermining their credibility or whatever. So, and for morphic resonance experiments, because you're looking for changes in time, you have to have quite controlled conditions. Most of the tests that have been done have been in the realm of human learning. Is it easier to learn something that other people have already learned? And there's no evidence that that is the case. And there are lots of examples of this. I mean, there have been experimental tests, for example, with the Evening Standard crossword puzzle. This was done years ago before things were online. Is it easier to solve the Evening Standard crossword puzzle the next day than when it's first published, when so many people have already done it? The answer is it did seem to get easier. It's a bit like the Wordle test that I've just referred to. So it's not difficult to test for morphic resonance. You're looking for changes in time. And you just need to have data over time. One example that I think is not my own experiments, but I predicted in the 1980s that IQ tests would get easier and easier for people to do because so many people do the same standardized test year after year. And actually, it was discovered by a psychologist called James Flynn that IQ tests had got easier over the years. No one had noticed because every year they standardize it to make the average 100. But if you look at the actual average scores, it turned out that over the 20th century, average scores had gone up by about 30%, not just in the US, where it was first detected, but in Japan, in Britain, in Germany, all over the world. And this is now called the Flynn Effect. And I think it's a perfect example of morphic resonance because you've got standardized tests. Now, it's very hard for people to explain this in any other way. They've tried to explain it by better diet, more TV, and then people say, well, actually, more TV and stuff would dumb people down. It wouldn't make those scores go up, etc., etc. And the parts of the IQ test where they've gone up most are the ones which rely not on knowledge, like what is the capital of France, that's something you'd have to learn, but on solving puzzles. And those are just the kinds of things where morphic resonance would play a part. So I think that the evidence for morphic resonance isn't difficult to understand. Only yesterday I was talking to the development of a developer of a video game because video games would be a good place to test for morphic resonance. And it turns out that in one a video game called Rock Band, which was about people learning to play instruments and play in a band. That's unlike most video games, it doesn't involve shooting people. Um, uh, the developers of Rock Band found that Rock Band 1, their first version, became too easy for people to do. They could learn the instruments too easily. The tunes were too simple. It wasn't to start with, but by the time they got to Rock Band 2, they had to make it all harder. When they got time to Rock Band 3, they had to make it all harder again. And the same with Rock Band 4. Now, unfortunately, they didn't keep records on player by player scores, and so otherwise you could plot this on a graph, and that would be the kind of thing I'm talking about in terms of tests of morphic resonance. There are more detailed tests in the learning of nematode worms and learning of fruit flies, which also are ways of looking for morphic resonance effects. So it's not difficult to test or difficult to understand.
And do you think it's been proven sort of in a strict scientific sense? Or, I mean, that would be almost impossible, I guess.
No, I wouldn't claim it's been proven in a strict scientific sense. I would say that the evidence so far, the circumstantial evidence and the experimental evidence, all points towards this being the right general approach.
Mm.
But because there hasn't been that much research, I wouldn't say it's been proven, and it's still very controversial within the scientific world.
Mm.
And because it's controversial, it makes it harder to prove because it's harder to persuade people to do experiments in labs when they won't get any credit for doing this, at least to start with. They'll get attacked and criticized and
Yeah.
ridiculed and so on. So, no, I would say that it's at the very least an open question. And the people who are against morphic resonance have not come up with any arguments against it. They simply ignore it or say it's rubbish or nonsense. So it's not as if it's been subject to a critical evaluation and discussion. It's simply, at the moment, mainly prejudice that is the main argument against it.
Well, it reminds me of the question about subtle energy research in practices like sort of healing or Tai Chi or Reiki, which psychologist Dean Radin, one of the few scientists who actually works with an organization that can get funding for these kind of things, IONS, he mentioned here on the show that a lot of the effects of these things, Reiki, for example, have been demonstrated to be effective, but without understanding the mechanism. So it's very, very hard when we don't have a working hypothesis of this, but we can see results. Should we just abandon these things as being beyond the scientific method? I mean, what's your take on science's obligation to look into the functioning of potential subtle energies?
Well, a classic example was gravitation with Sir Isaac Newton. When Newton came up with his law of gravitation, the mathematical law described how the moon attracted the tides on the Earth, or the Earth attracted the moon, or the sun attracted the other planets, and so on. But he had no idea how gravitation worked. He called it an occult force, a hidden force.
His letter
And
to Bentley, I've just quoted in his letter to Bentley, he said, I will, what is the cause of this? I will leave up to the readers. He clearly thought that there might be metaphysical action in place.
yes, and it wasn't until Einstein came up with the gravitational field in the 1920s that there was a kind of so-called mechanism for gravity. But it didn't stop scientists adopting it. It did stop them in France. Voltaire wrote about Newton's theory in France, which was not accepted in France for a whole generation after Newton. It was instantly accepted in England. But in France it wasn't, because the French intellectuals argued that to say that the Earth could attract the moon involved a mysterious attraction at a distance across empty space, which was animistic. Because, how could the Earth attract the moon in the way that a woman could attract a man? And that this was an animistic concept of Newton's that had no part in real hard science. And that really held them back. The French were being quite logical about it. The British just didn't bother. They thought as long as the calculations work, you just forget about how it actually happens. So but then you see this idea you've got to explain things. When Faraday came up with his idea of electrical and magnetic fields, he had no idea how they worked. And then Maxwell came up with his equations of electromagnetism 20 years later in terms of the ether, subtle matter permeating all space. Then Einstein came along and said in 1905 and said there's no such thing as the ether, it's just fields. Then quantum theory came along and quantum electrodynamics says, well, the interaction of light and matter is through the 0 point energy field and virtual photons and all sorts of mysterious virtual particles that we can't observe. All of these are different ways of interpreting what Faraday called fields without knowing what they were or how they worked. So, it's simply not the case that in science things don't get accepted if you can't explain them instantly in terms of well-articulated theories. Otherwise, Faraday's theories and Newton's theories would never have been accepted, and they're some of the most fundamental theories in science.
Excellent example.
Moreover, until relatively recently, no one knew how aspirin worked. Aspirin was used, a lot of herbal substances and derivatives like aspirin invented in the 1860s or 70s based on herbal cures like salicin in willow bark. It was used as a medicine. Herbs were all used as medicines for millennia, and no one knew how they worked at the molecular level. Aspirin was used for decades before anyone worked out, its molecular mode of action. So it's simply not the case that people reject things because they don't have a mechanism for them. You can think of countless examples. So I think people say that as a kind of to try and raise the bar to stop anything new coming into science. So we're not going to accept it till there's overwhelming evidence and there's a complete theory that's been accepted by all other scientists and published in Nature and, given the Nobel Prize. So the point is that scientific discoveries don't come into the world fully formed with all the evidence and all the theories and stuff. It's a process. And the process involves uncertainty and trying out new approaches and so on. Morphic resonance, I think, is a bit like Faraday's electrical and magnetic fields in the 1840s, before Maxwell's equations and before all the subsequent developments that came along.
So I'd like to bring into the conversation now the work of the Tufts Bioelectricity Lab of Michael Levin, which I know you've been following, as I'm curious if their findings change the morphic fields debate for you in any way. So here on the show, Michael explained how his lab's research has showed how bioelectric fields are clearly present on the frog embryos, defining the form that's about to be developed long before the tissue is created. And even more extraordinary, by copying and then projecting those fields elsewhere on the embryo, complex functional organs like eyes were able to develop in completely fully and functionally in places on the embryo that no one thought was possible because of these previous genetic understanding of where certain organs can and can't grow. Now, this research hasn't completely been integrated into the developmental biology consensus yet, although the word is spreading fast. What do you think are the implications of this for morphogenesis, and does it change anything for you about how we understand morphic resonance?
Well, Michael Levin, who I know personally, is, I think one of the best biologists working today. And he's very into the idea of fields, or morphogenetic fields, top-down causation in biology. Molecular biology is about bottom-up causation, lots of molecules interacting at somehow higher levels of order emerge. Well, what Michael Levin and I both agree about is you have to have top-down information, patterns of information. And electric fields, all fields are basically top-down causes. Magnetic field arranging with iron filings around a magnet and the lines of force, you've got a top-down cause. The field as a whole sets the pattern. The gravitational field keeping the moon in its orbit and attracting meteorites to the Earth is a top-down cause. When you're calculating the gravitational field, you don't take into account every atom inside the Earth and work out their little attraction to each other. And you take the whole Earth as a whole, and it's a top-down cause, the gravitational field. So he and I agree about that. I think what we also agree about is that morphogenetic fields work through electromagnetic fields. So I would say that the electromagnetic field he's measuring in his frog embryos Yes, indeed, this is a field that's helping to shape the development. But what shapes the electromagnetic field? You see, the normal study of electromagnetism is that electromagnetism arises from the way matter's already arranged, the way in which you've got cell membranes producing electrical potentials across them and so on. So, what shapes that electromagnetic field? It can't be electromagnetism itself, which is, as it were, passively responding to what's already there, that's already the already distributed electric charges and so forth. So, I think that it's shaped by the morphogenetic field. I think they work through electromagnetic fields. I think morphic fields work on our behavior and our activities through working through the electromagnetic fields in our brains, which shape brain activity. You know, there's waves all the time in our brains, all sorts of electromagnetic patterns. So I think they're electromagnetic fields, I think, are the interface, but not the explanation. And Michael Levin's also done work that I think points towards morphic resonance effects. And as you probably know, his flatworm experiments, where he trains them to learn a new trick. Then he cuts off their head, which contains what little brain they have. And the flatworms regenerate. They regenerate a new head and a new brain, and they can remember what they learned before. Now, I would expect that on the basis of morphic resonance, they tune into their own past by morphic resonance. Well, Michael Levin can't say that. You know, he's interested in morphic resonance. I mean, he read my book, A New Science of Life, years ago. I mean, he's very familiar with my work. He doesn't mention it in public because, you know, I'm dangerous to know on the whole. But I know he's familiar with it.
So there's another thing from Levin's results that I wanted to get your opinion on, Rupert. And it was the answer to the question I put to him about where physically the template for these fields and the corresponding structures is stored in the cell or wherever in the world. And he ventured quite unexpectedly to me that this template was stored in the same kind of place that mathematics lives. Which immediately reminded me also of Jung's collective conscious unconscious idea. And it was an idea that struck me as deeply Platonic, a world of kind of template, possible forms and patterns waiting to be manifested into the physical and temporal reality. Now, does your theory require a repository of forms from which the archetypal memory of nature is drawn? And if not, then where would morphic fields be encoded?
Well, it's interesting he said that because this is exactly the debate that I came into when I was doing my research at Cambridge in the 1970s. What are morphogenetic fields? Some people thought that they were electric fields. Harold Saxon Burr, who Levin is influenced by, and he wrote a book called The Life Field, said morphogenetic fields are electromagnetic. I came to the conclusion they couldn't be, because what would shape the electromagnetic fields? Then the other people working on morphogenetic fields at the time, notably Brian Goodwin at the University of Sussex, said that if they exist and if they have this effect, they must be mathematical. And so Brian was a Platonist, and he spent his time working out mathematical formulae. He started out as a mathematician, and mathematicians are often Platonists. They believe there's a world of maths beyond space and time that's not material, but works in the material world, that's available at all times and in all places through these mysterious laws of nature and mathematical equations that shape nature. But as I said right at the beginning, this was a debate that I was having with myself and with other people in the 1970s, because I didn't think either electric fields could explain it or Platonism, because Platonism doesn't account for evolution. It doesn't account for the adaptation over time, or what we now call epigenetic effects, where you can expose organisms to a new environment, they develop differently, and their offspring go on with this new form of development. That's not an eternal, timeless form. It's something shaped by history, by what happens. Now, it's precisely why I came up with the idea of morphic resonance, to explain how these could be inherited, how they could be, and how there could be something over and above the organism that shaped it through the morphogenetic field, but which was not Platonic. Instead of coming from outside nature, from the supernatural realm of Platonic forms, I thought it came from within nature, from the past, from previous organisms of the same type, by a movement that leapt across time. Morphic resonance leaps across time and space. It's not stored anywhere. It's a direct connection with the past. You see, if people say, where is memory stored? Then to ask that question, where is it stored, requires a spatial answer. It's got to be in a memory bank or in a hard drive or in a memory trace in the brain or in a modified synapse or in a phosphorylated protein or in DNA or RNA or something. It's got to be stored in a physical material structure. But memory is not a relation in space, it's a relation in time. And I think it works completely differently and I think that memory works by direct connections from the past to the present. That's why I use the term morphic resonance, that something in the past, here's something in the present, here's something in the past, they resonate. So if this is similar to what happened in the past, it starts resonating, and the resonance is, as it were, leaping across space and time. It's not being stored in between anywhere. It's potentially present everywhere, this morphic resonance.
Well,
So,
Rupert, I definitely want to do a show on memory that has a sensibility towards your time understanding of memory. So I'm certainly going to be coming back to you and asking you for a few specialists' names so we can find the right guest for that. But I must move on, Rupert, because there's a few things we've got to get in before you've got to go. Now, I think that the morphic resonance distributed memory question is really relevant to the second topic of today's episode, which is the idea of consciousness beyond the brain. Firstly, stretching up to from us up to planetary or even to cosmic consciousness. And I wanted to again use Michael's work as a bridge into this discussion. So I was fascinated by his evaluation of cellular cognition. So cells with goals and with agency that then combine together using gap junctions to form ever larger systems with corresponding sort of larger cells. And with at each stage with ever more complex goals and agency. And at each level, the structure's self has the impression that it's the controller of the lower levels. And it also has that it's separate from the higher levels. So, for example, maybe the liver in the scheme of the entire body. So my question was that if this hierarchy of cells functions at ever sort of higher levels, and these various levels of collaborative system are and continue right up to the full human body with trillions of cells and its highly adaptable nervous system and correlated consciousness or self, then why not beyond bodies into collective species consciousness or ecosystem consciousness or planetary or Gaia consciousness, as you've hypothesized, even solar consciousness, right up to a potential cosmic consciousness. So, Rupert, my question is, what evidence do we have that these self-organizing complex systems at all levels of nature, from the very small to the very large, organize beyond single organisms into collectives of plants, creatures, indeed planets, universes? Perhaps you can sort of build up the picture step by step so you don't blow our mind too much, Rupert.
well, I mean, I think that nature is organized, as you rightly put it, in a level of nested hierarchies, with each level within the one above. The higher level in the hierarchy isn't some kind of arbitrary thing that anarchists feel they'd have to rebel against. You know, the higher level in the hierarchy of the body is the whole body. The liver's included within the whole body. It's not as if the body is sort of bossing around the liver arbitrarily or something. The higher levels physically include the lower levels, and the liver includes the liver tissues and cells, and those include the molecules, and those include the atoms. So when we get beyond the individual organism, then you have societies of organisms, and the place where it's obvious that they're holistically organized is in flocks of birds or schools of fish, where you see starlings can change direction without bumping into each other. The individual birds have to know not only where their neighbors are, but where they're going to go when they change direction. Otherwise, they'd be bumping into each other all the time, and they don't. And the best mathematical models of starling fields or schools of fish treat them as field phenomena, a bit like iron filings in a magnetic field. Change the magnetic field, and all the iron filings change their direction or orientation. So these are already modeled in computer models as field phenomena. That people don't mention the word morphic field, but they use the analogy of magnetic fields to model them. So you could argue ecosystems are field phenomena. You could argue Gaia, the whole Earth, involves, as Lovelock pointed out, physiological type interactions between, the temperature, the weather, the winds, the oceans, the chemicals in the atmosphere, and so on. So you could argue that the whole Earth, Lovelock does argue this, and actually most people who are not very holistic in their thinking, the one exception for them would be Gaia. The Earth is treated holistically. But then you can argue the Sun, as I do in my paper, Is the Sun Conscious, is a holistically self-organizing system, and may well be conscious. The electromagnetic fields are the interface with the mind of the sun. I think it has very complex electromagnetic activity, which permeates the whole solar system. And so the whole solar system, as it were, the extended body of the sun. And round the whole thing, there's something called the heliopause, a kind of membrane, electromagnetic membrane around the whole solar system, with a galactic wind blowing around it, creating this kind of bubble of the whole solar system. Then the galaxy is clearly an autonomous unit of organization in the cosmos. There are billions of galaxies. They're discrete, separate structures, but they're all linked together by plasma threads that the cosmic network, which looks a bit like a brain, nerve cells in a brain, which has led some people to suggest this was the basis for the cosmic mind. Well, all this makes complete sense to me, that there's different levels of organization, fields at each level, with their own degree of consciousness, and because of morphic resonance, their own memory. You see, the sun would have a memory, not because it would try and store memory traces in fluid plasma and stuff, which wouldn't be very easy to conceive, but by resonating with itself in the past in similar states of activity. So one can relatively easily come to a view of the whole universe at different levels, with organizing fields at different levels. Each would have their own memory.
And I think what I loved about the way Michael was talking about it was that the way he was saying that at each level there is a corresponding self, which I associate with conscious experience. And he was saying that cellular cognition is absolutely clearly a form of consciousness. But what was super interesting is that smaller self of these contained subsystems within the body would have its own impression of self, and it would see itself as separate from those higher systems it was part of. And I guess that's why I sort of was interested in this idea that maybe our self-consciousness gives us the impression that we are isolated. But actually, at a larger level, if you were looking down from above, you would see that there was a collective consciousness happening in the entire species or in the entire ecosystem, etc. So anything to add there, Rupert, about this concept of a sort of self within a self within a self? Could this be part of the reason we have so much difficulty persuading the materialist that there is a sense of consciousness above the level of the brain?
Well, I think the materialists usually have a reductionist worldview where the most real things are the smallest. So in biology, it's molecules, and in physics, it's subatomic particles, which is why there's such an emphasis on molecular biology in biology and on particle accelerators in physics. So I think from our own experience, you see, we do experience ourselves as being both separate selves, and we obviously are. We have physical bodies with boundaries around us, and we can't occupy the same space as another person at the same time. The same is true of an atom or a molecule or a crystal. All at every level, or a cell, there's a kind of separation. The cell has a membrane around it. We've got skin around us. There's a limit to our body and indeed to our range of influence. So that's true. But we actually experience this all the time because we're not isolated individuals like Robinson Crusoe on a desert island. We're part of us, we're part of families, part of culture, part of society. And the very way we think through language is not our own. I mean, all of us inherit languages from, you and I inherit the English language through just growing up within it, and other people learn it, and other people inherit other languages, Cantonese or Indonesian or whatever. Um, so our whole mental life is connected with others. I mean, you look at people in the street and they're looking at their smartphones all the time, constantly interacting with other people on social media. And so much of our mental life is interactive with others. And when people are a member of a football team or a platoon in the army or a society or something, the idea of a common purpose is very clear. If you watch a football match, it's not all about each individual being completely brilliant, ignoring the others. It's working together as a team that means they can win the game. And so their individual consciousness is subsumed into what I would call the morphic field of the team, that they're part of a field larger than themselves. So I think we already know this from our own experience.
Okay. So Rupert, these first few years on the show, whilst honoring the tradition of repeatable scientific experimentation, because it is a science show, we've been exploring the many instances of apparent consciousness beyond the brain. Phenomena like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, sort of hoping to find this magical balance between rigorous requirements of the scientific method and the undeniable weight of a significant number of anecdotal reports. Now, you've been quite vociferous in your criticism of the reductionist materialist assumption that there is no consciousness beyond the synaptic firings of the brain. And you've studied in depth, for example, end-of-life experiences of both humans and animals. In your experience, what are the clearest examples of consciousness beyond the brain that you think we have sort of skeptic-friendly evidence to support?
Well, skeptics who are dogmatic materialists would never be friendly to the evidence.
They wouldn't read it.
They wouldn't read it. This is what happens. But the open-minded skeptics, of course, are influenced by evidence. And for me, one of the things I'm focusing on at the moment, I've been interested for years, but I'm actively researching it at the moment, is the feeling of being stared at. When you're in a room or something, you turn around, there's someone staring at you, or you look at someone from behind and they turn around. It's 95% of people have had that experience. I and others have done a lot of research on this and have shown that people really can tell when blindfolded and when separated by soundproof barriers, really can tell when they're being stared at. It's not a very big effect usually, but it's very significant because it's very repeatable. Children are more sensitive than grown-ups. And I've just recently released an app, which is on my website, sheldrake.org. If anyone wants to try it, in the menu bar it says take part. It's called the Staring app, which works on mobile telephones, where you can actually train yourself to get more sensitive to this. So here's a phenomenon that's very widely known. It happens with animals as well. It's, I think, evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. A prey animal that could tell when it was being looked at by a hidden predator would escape better than one that couldn't tell. So here's something where I think it tells us something about the nature of the extended mind in vision. You see, basically, I think every time we look at something, we're extending our mind into the world around us. The conventional view is that when I see you on the screen of my computer right now, light comes from the computer, it goes from you into the camera, it comes onto my screen as an image, that goes to my eyes, and then an image of Freddie on a computer screen appears inside my brain. That's the materialist assumption, it's all inside the head. But I think my image of you is where it seems to be on my computer screen. And I think when I look out of the window, the tree that's outside my window, that my image of the tree is right there where the tree is. It's in my mind, but not in my brain. I'm projecting it out. So I think all our images, every time we open our eyes and look at anything, are projected out. Our mind is extended all the time. I don't think you need any very subtle esoteric arguments that it's our daily experience from the moment we open our eyes in the morning, that the world around us is in our mind, we're interacting with it, but it's not in our brain. And so some people would say, oh, well, it's just that we create a virtual reality display inside the head that appears to be out there. And in fact, you might as well say it is out there because it's all a hallucination anyway. But basically, it's all produced in the brain. So where this becomes testable scientifically is through the sense of being stared at. That's why I'm so interested in it. Because if I'm projecting out an image of someone, say there's someone out there and I'm looking at them from behind, and I'm projecting out my image, which in a sense my mind is touching them, if they can feel that and then turn round by responding to my looks, it proves that my mind is extending beyond my brain. Its influence is not confined to the inside of my head.
Mm.
Now, materialists find the whole of this really hard to deal with. And because for them, it's the most central tenet of their faith that the mind is inside the brain. And so for them, the sense of being stared at is simply impossible. It can't happen, and therefore it doesn't happen. And therefore all the evidence is flawed or fraudulent without even looking at it. And I've had debates with Steven Pinker, with Michael Shermer, and with other skeptics, and they simply refuse to look at the evidence. Pinker argues that the Bayesian prior probability of something so impossible is so infinitesimally low that there's no point looking at the evidence because it simply is a waste of time to look at the evidence. And he regards that as a touchstone of rationality. Well, you see, when dealing with people like that, there's however much evidence you've got, however much everyday experience there is, however many people say it happens to me, however many animals respond to people's gaze, etc., won't make any difference. Um, that's the problem. So there is plenty of evidence this happens from people's own experience, from experimental tests. I'm organizing a new series of tests right now. But I don't expect it will make any difference to the thinking of people like Steven Pinker, committed dogmatic materialists. But for most people who are not committed dogmatic materialists, it's usually, most people are quite interested in this and it relates to their daily experience.
Now, Rupert, there are a million things from your extraordinary life and research that I'd like to talk to you about, but I've had to choose a last one because otherwise we're going to run too long. And so I want to talk to you about the compatibility of spiritual insight with science and also about mystical experiences. So, first off the bat, mystical experiences characterized particularly by a sense of non separation from the world, common but not guaranteed in psychedelic experiences, out of body experiences, meditation, near death experiences. But they can also just happen spontaneously too. They're quite disorientating experiences. They can often change the experiencer's worldview so radically that it can affect their relationship with friends and relations and colleagues. But on the whole, they tend to bring a deep sense of meaning and connection with the world and the creatures in it. What do you make of the importance of such experiences to our sense of purpose in life, but also as a source of knowledge, maybe for a deeper sort of the deeper nature of reality?
I think mystical experiences are at the heart of all religions. I think they all grew out of mystical experiences. I mean, Buddhism grew out of the Buddha's mystical experience of enlightenment sitting under a Bodhi tree. It didn't come through him doing a PhD at some institute of advanced studies or something. Christianity grew out of Jesus's mystical experiences of union with God. Um, so I don't think, and the Hindu sages meditating in caves in the Himalayas, who give rise to the Upanishads and the great teachings of Hinduism. What these experiences show is that we're connected with something greater than ourselves, forms of consciousness vastly greater than ourselves. And there are many different spiritual practices. In fact, I've written 2 books about them, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, each one dealing with 7 different spiritual practices, which have all been studied scientifically. And the scientific studies show that people who have these practices are healthier, happier, and live longer than those that don't. Because they feel more connected, they feel their life has more meaning, more structure. And so they are indeed about connection. Connection with forms of consciousness greater than our own, connection with other people, singing and chanting. As you know, my wife, Jill Pass, teaches singing and chanting in workshop format. And when I've seen many times when people go to those workshops, they're just sort of just normal and sort of separate. But after singing and chanting together for a couple of days, they usually emerge bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and interconnected with each other, because when you sing together, you're literally in resonance with each other. You come into resonance with the whole group. And if you're singing a mantra or a traditional chant, then by morphic resonance, you come into connection with all those who've done it before you. And that's true of rituals in general. Rituals which are performed by a group bring together the members of the group, but they also, by morphic resonance, because rituals have a repetitive structure similar to the way it's been done before, connect you with those who've done it before, giving a much greater sense of connection with the ancestors, with those who've gone before, with other forms of consciousness. And all of us, being social animals, need to have a feeling of belonging. The fact we need, and people who are, the worst punishment you can inflict on people is solitary confinement. It's a terrifying experience for people because it's not our nature to be solitarily confined. It's our nature to be interactive social beings. Like many other species, humans are social animals. So I think that the interconnection we can feel through mystical experiences tells us that our consciousness is part of a much greater consciousness in the universe. And if you take the holistic view we were discussing earlier, there are many potential levels of consciousness above our own. Gaia, if Gaia has consciousness, the whole planet, then it's obviously bigger than any one of us individually. And if the solar system has consciousness, then Gaia, this planet, is just part of a much larger whole. And if the sun is conscious, it may be conscious of all that's happening here on Earth and throughout the solar system. And the galaxy is obviously greater than the sun. And the sun, the solar system, is one of billions of stars and solar systems in the galaxy, like cells in a larger organism. And there may be a galactic mind, maybe a cosmic mind. And most religions suppose that beyond the cosmic mind, there's also a mind that transcends the cosmos, that in a sense gives rise to nature, which can be called God or Brahma or whatever. There's different names for this ultimate reality. And in a sense, our mystical experiences connect us with higher levels of consciousness of which we're a part. And I think that is both normal for people to feel and necessary, actually, for spiritual and mental health. And we live in a materialist society where people have been indoctrinated with the materialist worldview through education and through the media and through just the sort of standard default materialist atheist position of our secular culture, which means they feel separated, isolated, disconnected from tradition, from the ancestors, from these other forms of consciousness, with the result that they feel pointless, meaningless, and depressed. And so depression is the endemic feature of secular societies, large-scale depression, millions and millions of people on antidepressants because they no longer have this sense of connection. So I don't think it's particularly a new discovery that we need this sense of connection. I think humans in all societies have actually taken it for granted until the birth of the modern era, when we had this secular, separative way of thinking about nature, which is so disastrous individually, psychologically, but also for our relationship with the natural world, causing extreme disharmony between human life and the whole planet.
So, Rupert, whilst we're on mystical traditions, just to close, there is a preconception in post-Enlightenment science that spirituality and religion can't really work alongside science as a source of truth. But my previous guests, physicists Marcelo Gleiser and Avi Loeb, argue the opposite, that a sense of wonder and humility in the face of the sheer unimaginable realm of possibilities of the unknown leads naturally to a kind of religious respect for the truth that may be just beyond even our conception. You're possibly one of the most publicly Christian scientists out there. How do you reconcile science and spirituality? And how does your faith's metaphysical stance color the way you interpret scientific data? Just to close.
Well, I think that ultimately the whole universe comes forth from consciousness. And this, you could say, is in a secular form, is what idealist philosophy, like
Castra.
Castrop and people would say. But instead of having what he calls analytical idealism, which is, I think, a somewhat undifferentiated view of ultimate consciousness, the Christian view, like the Hindu view and like many other views, sees this ultimate consciousness as having three aspects within it. It's not just an undifferentiated blob. It rather has an internal structure. And in the Hindu version, it's Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, conscious being is the ground of all things. Chit, which is the consciousness of things, names and forms, the Hindus say, nama, rupa. So if you're conscious, you're usually conscious of something. Like I'm conscious now, and I'm conscious of seeing your face on the screen and being in a room, being in London, and that sort of thing. It's not just undifferentiated consciousness. I may have glimpses of that through meditation, but normal everyday consciousness is filled with names and forms, the contents of consciousness. There's a knower and there's what's known, to put it another way, the way the Kashmiri Shaivites put it, And then, as they would say, there's the means of knowledge. There's the knower, the known, and the means of knowledge. Or Sat Chitananda, you've got Sat, the knower, like the conscious knower, the ground of knowledge and of being, that which is known. And then Ananda is joy or bliss. The ultimate mind is blissful. It's constantly, continually in a state of bliss, which is why mystical experiences are usually blissful. They're contacting a mind which is itself infused with bliss or joy. And the Christian version of the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, which is the traditional Christian way of thinking about God, certainly not God outside the universe sitting on a white cloud with a beard. I mean, that's the most atheists don't believe in childish images of God that most Christians don't believe in either. But my view of God, is Orthodox Christian view really, is that the God the Father is the ground of all being. God, when he first announces himself to Moses in the burning bush, says, I am who I am. That's conscious being in the present, is the ground of being. Then the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, in the beginning was the word, Logos. Logos is names and forms, it's the contents of consciousness, that which has form, structure, meaning, interconnection, and so on. And then the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is always represented by wind, air, breath, flow, flames of fire, flight of birds. It's the moving or dynamical principle. And so I see that this ultimate source of all things being expressed in nature through, I think the Holy Trinity is an ontological Trinity. It's not just a man-made model. I think this is the ultimate ground from which things come. And the Holy Spirit is expressed in nature through what we call energy in science. It's, the flow of energy, of light. All of these things are manifestations of a moving principle of change activity. The Logos principle is expressed through form, and there's every kind of form in nature. There's the forms of galaxies, stars, planets, molecules, crystals, tissues, organs, flocks of birds. All these are forms, and words are forms too. Words have a particular structure or form, which is why we recognize them.
So you think these two traditions, both so prominent in human history, you think they can coexist? Can they work on the same basis in the search for truth that's so sort of fundamental to human nature?
I don't see why not. I mean, the only reason we think that they can't is because we've had 300 or 400 years of mechanistic materialism that says that the universe, well, to start with, it was a mechanistic dualism. Nature's dead, mechanical, inanimate, and there's consciousness out there totally separate. Then the materialists come along in the 19th century. There's no consciousness out there, God, angels, and mysterious human spirits or souls. There's just mechanical nature. Um, then that's, of course, atheistic and opposed to any form of religion, but it's based on a particular metaphysic, a metaphysic that says our minds are nothing but our brains and so forth, which I think is both flawed, both as a metaphysical theory and as a scientific, the basis for science. As I show in my book, The Science Delusion, science is actually being held back by these mechanistic materialist dogmas, which are actually preventing scientific inquiry in many areas and constricting science within a narrow dogmatic framework, which is bad for science, bad for nature, bad for people. And the title of that book in America is actually better than the English title, Science Set Free. And I think that by challenging these materialist dogmas, science will be liberated. And I don't see any conflict at all with um, an overall spiritual view like that, like the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Um, I don't see that that inhibits scientific inquiry. It certainly doesn't inhibit my own. I mean, I've been a practicing Christian, since 1976 or something. Um, I haven't found that it inhibits my curiosity or my ability to do experiments or my ability to think scientifically. But I have found that the materialist dogma severely inhibits the ability of many of my scientific colleagues to think scientifically or
Well,
to.
the good news, listeners, is that this is slowly changing. And we have a show in this series with physicist Marcelo Gleiser about post-reductionist science, about how the re-inclusion of the subjective into the reality of objectivity is a fundamental part about the way we go forward making science. And this is definitely starting to have ripples. We see this with philosophers like Evan Thompson and also his co-author Adam Frank, the astronomer who's also been thinking about planetary consciousness like Rupert. So do check that post-reductionist science episode out, because Rupert was obviously a trailblazer back in the 70s, but we're seeing a lot of scientists getting on board with this disapproval of dogmatic reductionist science. Rupert Sheldrake, thank you so much for your time. A great, great pleasure to meet you, and all the very best.
A pleasure to talk with you, Freddie.